I think all of you will have, each one of you will have 20 minutes, and then I will have some short remarks, and we'll open the floor for discussion.
Thanks, Lavinia.
20 minutes.
I'll take out my watch.
And I'll be ruthless.
Good. I guess. We'll wait 20 minutes. First of all, I want to start out and thank the organizers, Vlad and Bogdan. This is a tremendous conference, and I'm very pleased to be here. My talk is entitled Transitional Justice and the Politicization of Memory in Post-1989 Europe. I actually, I got the title from the organizers, and I looked at it and I thought, oh, well, okay, but let's put the word politicization in there because that makes it a little bit spicier. But the title was good because it gave me an idea to think about some issues. I will end this talk talking about history and memory, even though I won't really bring them up that much in the beginning, so hopefully you'll see where I'm going. Secondly, transitional justice. This is a theme that I've worked on for a while, partly for personal reasons, trying to make sense of the relationships I had with people when I lived in East Germany before 1989. But secondly, transitional justice, because it seems to me that it always involves interpretations of history. So if you look at the activities of judges in the case of criminal trials or administrative counsels in the case of Stasi disqualification issues or administrative courts involved in property restitution, what you always find is officials making judgment about what took place in the past. And for me, the fact that they do so in a correct way is incredibly important if you're talking about justice. A lot of what we've discussed also up to now has to do with officials, politicians, and the like, interpreting history in a way that is, at best, therapeutic and at worst, malicious. So, transitional justice. In late May 2008, the past came back to haunt Gregor Gysi. Marianne Birtler, the commissioner of Germany's Office for the Disposition of the Files of East Germany's former state security service, Stasi, produced records that confirmed what had long been suspected. Gysi, a former lawyer and Bundestag-Fraktionschef of Germany's increasingly popular left party, Die Linke, had, in quotes, knowingly and voluntarily shared information about his clients with the Stasi. This revelation led to a modest inter-party debate about Gysi's suitability to be a member of parliament. Several members of the Christian Democratic Union demanded his resignation. In response, Gysi argued that the case against him was based on a flawed understanding of the role of a lawyer in East Germany. But both he and his critics knew what the battle was really about. By 2008, Die Linke had become the fourth largest party in the Bundestag and was an active presence in many of the Länder. Thus, all of Germany's mainstream parties were pleased to have the opportunity to transmute the accusations against Gysi into a compelling lesson for the voting public. Die Linke was unfit to govern, they argued, because its leaders were unwilling to come to terms with their sordid past. Not to be outdone, Die Linke's leaders were equally opportunistic in reacting to these attacks. They sought to transform the Gysi case into l'affaire Gysi. The governing parties were, as Gysi himself put it, distraught by the success of his party and desperately searching for ways to contain its ascendancy. For this reason, Gysi maintained the Stasi accusations were not about him at all. They were the opening salvos in an epical battle between the status quo parties of old Germany and a fresh vision of Germany's future. At least Gysi wanted us to believe that more salvos were coming. In fact, when the federal elections to the Bundestag took place last September and Die Linke squared off against the CDU, Gysi's Stasi connections came up briefly, but they were only a blip on the radar compared to the weighty issues of domestic economic policy, foreign affairs, and so forth. Nonetheless, one way or another, it seemed, the prospects for an affaire Gysi had vanished. Nonetheless, The fact that the event did not amount to all that it was promised to be does not mean that it was insignificant. For at least three reasons, this apparently unremarkable episode in the history of the Federal Republic can provide us insight into the long, strange trip that the theme of transitional justice has taken since it first emerged as a burning issue in Eastern Europe in 1989. First, there is the matter of prediction. To listen to the experts back then, one could have assumed that a controversy surrounding, like that surrounding Gezi, would not even come up 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It could not be in the Federal Republic's interest, we were assured, to let the communist past get in the way of the full and efficient incorporation of the German Democratic Republic into the unified German state. Second, there is the issue of expectations. As interesting as the dispute over Gezi may have been for observers, such as this writer, who were looking for it, the Eastern Europeans who engaged in the heated debates over the merits of transitional justice in 1989 and 1990 had anticipated much more. Whether they were in East Berlin, Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, and so forth, the proponents and opponents of differing forms of reckoning with the dictatorial past, criminal trials, political disqualification, property restitution, truth commissions, and so forth, had expected a gut-wrenching period of hard decisions and emotional anguish. Yet the attacks on Gezi promised about as much incitement as any routine debate in the Bundestag. Moreover, they were politically transparent, not transcendent. Finally, we must ponder the future. In the 1990s, the proponents of transitional justice in many, although by no means all post-communist states, had the satisfaction of seeing that measures of some kind had been taken to acknowledge past wrongs. But when one takes into account cases like the Gezi Institute, he would like to have his own institute, the Gezi incident, it is hard to be confident that these issues will have any staying power. With every new generation, it seems as though the challenge for policymakers will not be to come to terms with a bygone age. The challenge will be to remember it. In this presentation, I draw upon examples of Gezi's renewed encounter with history to make three general points. First, I will seek to explain why the expectations of learned observers in the early 1990s about the post-communist future were frequently based upon a flawed understanding of the options available to democratic elites. Second, I seek to shed light on why many of these controversies seem to have lost their fire in the 2000s. And then finally, once I've made these points, I want to pose a difficult question, and that is transitional justice, once addressed, likely to be less and less relevant to the politics of democratic regimes over time? As I shall suggest, there's no reason to think that the battles over this topic are at an end. Instead, the more important issue is how and to what purpose they are conducted. My first section is called The Limits of Rational Action. And I begin by quoting a famous, or actually contradicting a famous British philosopher. You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you find that what you get is not at all what you need. Social scientists and commentators seem to have neglected this maxim when they were suddenly confronted with the emergence of a host of fledgling democracies in Eastern Europe. As they rushed to make sense of the unexpected, they gave in to the temptation of trying to enlighten these countries' new leaders about the best way to deal with long-standing legacies of dictatorship and oppression. The only problem, but a big one for me, was that they misconstrued the available options. To understand this point, it's helpful to put ourselves into the shoes of democratic theorists more than a decade before these events. At this juncture, in another part of the world, history presented scholarship with a tantalizing challenge, and this was, particularly for political scientists, to make sense of an earlier democratic cascade, as one after another of the military regimes that had defined Latin American politics chose to return to the barracks. To explain this remarkable retreat from authoritarianism, social scientists focused on the process of negotiations between the leaders of the old regimes and the reformers who rose to replace them. The key to every successful transition, the experts concluded, many of whom are colleagues of mine like Guillermo O'Donnell, the experts concluded had been for the democratizers to persuade the dictators that they would suffer no repercussions for their decision. And then an important corollary to this argument was that if the aspiring elites violated this tacit agreement, then the predecessors would be disposed to make trouble for them and to try to come back. On the basis of these assumptions, both academics and policymakers reasoned that democratization and transitional justice were potentially mutually exclusive categories. The rational choice, many reasoned, was to minimize the latter in order to facilitate the former. And here I quote Samuel Huntington, who talked about how that in cases in which the long-term viability of a new regime was uncertain, it would be desirable to not pursue any form of transitional justice. I also quote the Chilean lawyer and civil rights activist Jose Pepe Zalaquet, who says basically the same thing, and based on his own experience in Chile. As things turned out, however, Latin America has generally not been a good model for democratizing states in other parts of the world. It's not even been a good model for itself, but that's another discussion. When Huntington, Zalaquet, and others missed was that few of the new Eastern European democracies were in such advantageous positions to pick and choose their options. In the words of a prescient 19th century historian, their leaders wanted to make their own history, but they could not make it as they pleased, but only under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted by the past. This point should have been self-evident to outside observers. After all, in any country that is struggling through a difficult transition, policymaking about weighty issues will rarely take the form of a kind of smorgasbord in which you can go through it and you can say, I'll take 2 truth commissions and 1 political trial, but please no property restitution. With the possible exception of Hungary, the post-communist regimes of Eastern Europe have found that getting what they want on the subject of retrospective justice has been very difficult. Consider Poland's experience, and then I do. And I talk about how Poland represented for so many people a transition by negotiation. So they looked at Latin America, they also looked at Spain, and therefore people like Mazowiecki argued that one should draw a thick line between the past and the improved, better, more liberal policies that would be pursued in the future. And 20 years after the event, we can see that this has turned out to be much harder than they wanted. The Polish history was not a smorgasbord. Secondly, in contrast, Romania's post-communist government tried a different approach. Rather than taking a clear stand on the desirability of retrospective justice, it pretended that there wasn't any injustice, or at least none involving any of its members, past or present. By the 2000s, however, long after many transitologists would have considered the matter irrelevant, the questioning of addressing past wrongs reemerged with a fury. No doubt the manipulation of historical truth had something to do with this, and this is a subject that some of our participants have been interested in and directly involved in. In many ways, however, for me the most compelling example of the problems of transitional justice has been presented where it was least expected to arise, and that's Germany, because after all, if any state was perfectly positioned to decide the appropriate policies for a transition to democracy, it should have been the Federal Republic. In every respect in 1990, economically, politically, administratively, and even psychologically, Bonn seemed to be ideally positioned to dictate the terms of reunification. And indeed, pundits still draw upon this idea when they say that in every meaningful respect, the German case of decommunization was a special case. But here as well, the generalizations come up short. The evidence of Stasi complicity in the Gysi case and thousands of other people's secret police dossiers meant that the West German government had less control over the issue than its leaders wanted. Now, here I just talk about how from the beginning, West Germany's leaders regarded the opening and dissemination of the files as, at best, a mixed blessing. Given the turbulence in East Germany, they feared that revelations of the Stasi secrets would open old wounds rather than healing them. And here I'm making a reference to therapeutic uses of history, because this always comes up in transitional justice writings. And I think also the West Germans were concerned about secrets about their own negotiations with the GDR that they would have preferred didn't become public. As a result, contrary to the demands of many East German dissidents, West German policymakers had deep misgivings about allowing broad or unconstrained access to these records. Yet, they recognized that there was little they could do to dampen demands that they provide some form of access to the records. And this was because the issue was essentially taken out of their hands. In December of 1989 and January of 1990, Eastern German protesters of all sorts overran the Stasi offices throughout East Germany, and they took control of the holdings. And once they had done that, everybody from people wanting to know about what was in their personal dossiers to responsible journalists and historians to other less savory types, everybody wanted access to these files. And they were also already being spread throughout Eastern Germany. As a result, when West German officials arrived on the scene and contemplated the disposition of the records, they could not put the genie of oppression back into the box. And here we return to Gysi's predicament. For 19 years, Die Linke's star player had been able to dodge rumors and accusations about his involvement with the Stasi, but in the end, the record's existence meant that it did not really matter whether 2 weeks or 2 decades had elapsed before his deeds finally caught up with him. This section, the next section, I'm going back and forth on, so it will be entitled either The Loss of Drama or The Absence of Drama, ? If Gysi's story demonstrates that the passage of time doesn't necessarily hide all blemishes, it's equally important to ask why the confirmation of his complicity should have meant so little 20 years later. Well, 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and 30 years after the issue initially would have arisen. One could answer this question by arguing that Gysi's transgressions as a lawyer were simply not worth remembering. But this assertion would be unfair to his clients, who counted on his objectivity and independence from the state. A different answer, which I find more compelling, is to be found in our expectations. When we look closely, it turns out that even in cases of deep violations of trust and integrity, the pursuit of justice is often less satisfying than either its advocates hope for or its opponents fear. Certainly this answer would not have been welcome news to those East German dissidents and regime critics who waged a moral battle, a moral campaign on this issue in the early 1990s. To listen to them, one would have thought that the prospects for German reunification depended upon the ability of the GDR's former citizens to make peace with each other first. Thus, for these activists, the opening of the walls was an invaluable opportunity to use the truths within their pages to promote this goal. And at this point, I talk about two notable figures who advocated slightly different approaches to this question. One was Joachim Gauck, who was the first director of the agency for the management of the Stasi files. 5 minutes, okay. And the second is a guy named Friedrich Schorlemer. Both are pastors. And what's interesting about both of them is that they saw this as a therapeutic process. From a philosophical, theological, and therapeutic history, this is dealing with the files, the two pastors' prescriptions were attractive. They envisioned a world in which individual fulfillment would be realized through communitarian discourse. Nevertheless, when one considers the high demands they were making, it is not hard to see why those whom they were seeking to advise were bound to disappoint them. For victims and wrongdoers alike, resignation and not reconciliation has all too often been the available response to adversity. And at this point, what I do is to create kind of composite portraits of people that I knew in East Germany, both perpetrators and victims who tried to deal with these issues. And what I argue in both cases, or I make the case in both instances, that there hasn't been the kind of reconciliation, there hasn't been the kind of therapeutic process for either perpetrators or victims that people like Gauck and Schorlemer desired and anticipated. The failure to achieve closure in these cases of personal betrayal would have a numbing effect on any person. If these two people came up short, how then could one reasonably expect to locate much drama in the matter of Gysi? Now, at this juncture, the reader may feel that I've placed him or her into an odd position because I began this essay with a recent episode in the long chronicle of transitional justice, but then I made two general arguments. First, I suggested that German decision makers did not so much choose to achieve justice in facilitating access to the files. Rather, the demand for justice forced itself upon them. Secondly, I contend that whatever measures were taken to respond to this challenge, they would rarely be as satisfying or as meaningful as they were meant to be. After 20 years, do these conclusions mean that it is time to stop talking about the Gysis of the post-communist world? The answer to this question depends upon what we mean to accomplish. On the one hand, there is nothing in principle that should prevent anyone from investigating, say, the concealment of human rights violations and so forth. But on the other hand, I've already suggested that the battle between Die Linke's leader and the CDU had almost everything to do with politics and very little to do with justice. To the extent that the latter issue even arose, it was transitional justice as cliché. All that was required of Die Linke's opponents, it seemed, was to invoke the word Stasi, and their work was done. And in the other parts of this world, one could do the same thing with STB, the UB, Zagorno, Securitate, and so forth. This insight brings us to a second question. Given the time elapsed since the democratizing regimes of East Europe first began to wrestle with the misdeeds of their predecessors, why should we even care if aspects of the communist era are subject to political manipulation? The pursuit of transitional justice happens to provide an instructive response to this query. Every judgment that we make about an individual's behavior carries with it the possibility of altering or shaping the memory of the past and creating new memories. Or new memories in quotes. Well, maybe eventually memories. When these judgments are based on a conscientious examination of the evidence and due consideration of the reasons for making them, the record will speak for itself. But when they are based upon formulaic thinking and opportunistic motives, our ability to distinguish between what really happened under decades of dictatorship and what others want us to believe is impaired. And then here, instead of talking about Gysi, I kind of up the ante and talk about Lech Wałęsa and some of the charges against him, and I don't try to say who's right in the debate. But then I do say, still, the instrumentalization of the charges against Wałęsa could have the unintended consequence of lessening one of the greatest achievements in Polish history. Far from furthering the cause of justice, and instrumentally tarnish Wałęsa could adversely affect future generations' memory of the independent trade union movement that he founded. Finally, last paragraph, the politicization of transitional justice reminds us of the pernicious effects that this kind of thinking can have on the present. Whatever the issue, when partisan calculations induce a country's leaders to become reflexive rather than reflective, they sully an essential feature of democratic life. By cheapening the power of words, they make it more difficult for politicians to engage in reasoned dialogue about complex and contentious issues. When one personality begins a debate with a cliché, it's hard for another to respond with an original thought. When these exchanges become habit, public confidence in democracy erodes. In making these points, I don't mean to say that the controversial topics, such as the one I've discussed, should be avoided. To the contrary, there is no statute of limitations governing the pursuit of justice, as the long-standing American debate over the moral and practical implications of slavery attests. Rather, I only mean to suggest that these issues should be broached with the care and authenticity that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you. Our second presentation is 1989 and a Modern Spirit for a New Modernity by Carl Zoltan, professor here at University of Maryland.
Thank you. So 4 preliminary comments. First, I would like to thank the chair for giving me 4 hours. I would like to thank the chair for giving me 4 hours for my presentation. I very much appreciate it. Second point, actually, I did change the title, so it's now Moderation, Modernity in 1989, a kind of streamlined version. Third preliminary comment, those of you who read the paper, if it's available in the might be puzzled in the second paragraph. I have a reference to the Cod War. This is not an attempt to inject Icelandic history into our discussion. It really should be Cold War. Finally, fourth preliminary comment, and I just realized at the end of last session that there is actually a Maryland School of Interpretation of 1989. I realized that with Jeffrey's comments, and of course I knew Vlad's position. So the Maryland School is very strongly in support of world historical significance of 1989, and I believe I'm an extremist in the Maryland School, since I'm going to be talking about moderation. Yes. All right, so much for the preliminary comments. Let me start the paper, or at least bits and pieces of the paper. We celebrate anniversaries of years, but years, even as miraculous as 1989, are not good analytical categories. When celebrating the anniversary of 1968 last year, it made sense to me to discuss the divided spirit of the 60s, not just 68. So when celebrating the anniversary of 1989, it also makes sense to discuss the spirit of the larger and longer period of which 1989 was a symbolic and real high point. So in the paper, I take a broader look at 1989, not at the year, but at the broader historical period of which the year was the high point. The period we can begin in 1985, when Gorbachev came to power, for 1986 by People Power Revolution in Philippines. There's actually the 88 events in Burma. The miraculous year of 1989 in Europe, the tragic year 1989 in China, collapse of the Soviet Union 91, the end of the Cold War global system, Maastricht Treaty in 1992, the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. The end of the Cold War provoked a broader wave of democratization, whose other high point was the collapse of the apartheid regime in South Africa. It was roughly a decade of profound political transformation, for which we can choose 2 symbolic endpoints: the democratic election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, or the creation of WTO in 1995. A triumph of constitutional democracy over despotism, or a crucial next step in the development of global institutional architecture. Still, the events of '89 were the center point of this decade, and I'll treat them as such. These events transformed the world, and in an unexpected way. The scale of changes suggested that to understand them, we need to rethink our understanding of the broad patterns of history. But the received accounts of the broad patterns of history did not really do a good job. There was a lack of fit between the depth of change, which suggested we were witnessing a revolution, and hence radical politics, and the content of the change, opposed to human destructiveness and violence, taking seriously a commitment to impartial principle and the common good, expressing it even in language of politics of truth, insisting on the value of pluralism and diversity, which suggested we're witnessing a moderate politics in action and not radicalism. So with this as a kind of preliminary, what my maper, right. Actually, I have not written a maper. But I have written, however, a paper. So it has the following, the paper has the following sections. And I'll give you a sense of the whole paper. It gives a kind of interpretation of the collapse of communism in Europe and the interpretations that are best seen as a rebirth rather than revolution, driven by a partnership of reform from above and reform from below. And so that part of the section is divided into three, that part of the paper, rather. Reform from above as a project, reform from below as a project, and then the idea of rebirth as a form of deep social transformation that is not a revolution. Then the second part of the paper is a discussion of the legacy of 1989, but not legacy in the region that we've been discussing. That's well covered by other papers, and it's not really all that inspiring. But it's the legacy in the world. And that, I think, is quite inspiring. And then the third part of the paper is a discussion of the significance of 1989 in terms of two competing forms of the project of human creative power, as I like to say. One form revolutionary and the other form moderate. And the final part of the paper is then a discussion of this moderate alternative to the revolutionary model in more detail. So I can't do all of that in 20 minutes. Let me do bits and pieces. I wanted to go in a little bit of detail on the first part, which is reform from above. Again, the picture of 89 I sketch here is that it's a partnership of reform from above and reform from below. So the collapse of communist Europe is best seen as a rebirth rather than a revolution, driven by this partnership. The collapse of communism involved a number of examples of explicit roundtable agreements, Hungarian and Polish being most prominent, but the whole process can best be seen, I think, as a product of a kind of tacit partnership of reform from above initiated by Gorbachev and company in headquarters, and reform from below initiated in the various provinces, especially Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. So the basic principles of the politics that led to the collapse of communism can be read off the political thought of the anti-communist opposition, especially before it took power in 1989 and became preoccupied with the short term, and the political thought of Gorbachev, especially after he lost power in 1992 and ceased to be preoccupied with the short term and sort of moved away from the ad hocism that was discussed earlier today. I've, in the past, written about ideas of civic society, of politics centering on truth, that is, on the ideas that motivated the project of reform from below. Let me say more about Gorbachev. And I want to approach Gorbachev in a somewhat unusual way, that is from the end. To understand the project of reform from above, I think we should look at him, and we need to trace his path. He begins with a return to his political roots, Lenin and so on, but I think we understand better the nature of the events of '89 if we consider in more detail not Gorbachev's starting point, which was really not up to him, so to speak, and not his ad hoc adjustments in the years leading up to '89, including '89, but where he ends up at the end of this transition. So I looked at three sources as important sources of where he ends up. One is his conversations with his old friend from student days and leader of the 68 reforms in Czechoslovakia, Zdeněk Mlynář. These were published in Czechoslovakia in 1995. The second source is his programmatic essay, The Search for a New Beginning, published in English also in 1995. And the third source is his significant involvement in the development of the Earth Charter. The Charter is a declaration of global principles, values, and policy commitments with a strong environmentalist angle that emerged from a broad consultative process across the global civic society. And the process was launched jointly by Gorbachev and Maurice Strong, who was Secretary General of the Rio Earth Summit, and they launched in 94 in response to the perceived failure of the Earth Summit in 92. The heart of the Earth Charter is the principle of universal responsibility stated in the preamble. I quote, "We must decide to live with a sense of universal responsibility, identifying ourselves with the whole Earth community as well as our local communities. We're at once citizens of different nations and of one world." What struck me about that particular statement is how much it echoed in my mind a number of things that Václav Havel famously said about the importance of the feeling of responsibility for the world as a kind of guiding idea of the opposition to communism. So what we see in Gorbachev's political thinking when we consult these sources is a continuing verbal commitment to socialism, but which now stands for no more than a commitment to widely shared ideals. In the discussions with Młynarz, it is his old friend that emphasizes the distinctively socialist themes of opposition to capitalism, organizing the working class, and so on. Gorbachev seems uncomfortable with the themes. He sees them as ideological, and he wants nothing to do with ideology. He wants a value-based conception of socialism, with freedom, equality, justice, and solidarity as the central values. The socialist idea, he writes, could become global humanism. In fact, global humanism seems to be Gorbachev's project. And the details have a distinctly moderate flavor. He's opposed to all extremism, ideology, imbalance. He writes, "Genuinely historical ways of solving problems on the level of entire civilizations generally transcend the framework of ideologies." And you could have any opposition figure saying things like that. He continues restating in strong language a perennial theme of moderates through the ages. One-sidedness has shown itself to be chief cause of crisis and failure. This mixture of themes from liberal, socialist, and conservative traditions is striking. The conservative liberal socialism that Kołakowski once imagined and that seemed to be the program of solidarity in its glory days now seems embraced by Gorbachev. In The Search for a New Beginning, he writes, in words that really channel Burke, "Each generation inherits from its predecessors the material and spiritual wealth of civilization, and each generation is responsible for preserving this inheritance and developing it for succeeding generations." I mean, the famous quote from Burke is almost word for word. Okay, so the spirit of Lenin has been really left far behind. Arguably, Gorbachev's main preoccupation is one that is also central to the moderate tradition. It is a preoccupation with the need to control and diminish the influence of human destructive power. In the earlier years, when he still rules a nuclear-armed superpower, his preoccupation is with reducing the prospects of nuclear war. Nuclear weapons made it imperative to end the Cold War and not to use force as communism and the Soviet Union were collapsing. In the 1990s, Gorbachev shifts to a preoccupation with the environmental crisis, the other main threat due to human destructiveness, and associates himself with the development of the Earth Charter. The one thing that remains of the old Leninist commitments, it seems to me, is the idea that humanity is entering a new stage and ought to do so. This message is clear from both the title, The Search for a New Beginning, Developing a New Civilization, and the content of his 95 programmatic essay. "We're on a threshold of a new era," he writes. "The present civilization has exhausted itself." But it's not capitalism that he's talking about, rather a civilization based on imperatives of industrialism, uncontrolled exploitation of human and natural resources, social and national disintegration, suppression of human liberties. These are all his words. The key categories are those of civilization, the preservation and development of civilization, the moral commitments necessary for this task. Quote, "The roots of the current crisis of civilization lie within humanity itself. Our intellectual and moral development is lagging behind. Only by renouncing selfishness and attempts to outsmart one another to gain an advantage at the expense of others can we hope to ensure the survival of humankind." It is hard not to hear in these words echoes of old dreams of a Marxist about a future society where no incentives are necessary because selfishness will have been overcome. But, it's not just a dream of Marxists. Humankind has become mortal, he continues, and it is impossible to disagree. But his analysis in response brings to mind language and arguments calling for a new civilization developed by Arnold Toynbee. More than any thinker, by Toynbee more than any thinker in the socialist tradition. Toynbee is a bit of a forgotten man today, But in the 50s, he was celebrated by a Time magazine cover story as the free world's intellectual answer to Karl Marx. Toynbee belongs to a larger group of intellectuals, much of whose work was done in response to the great destructiveness of 1930s and 40s. He responded neither with despair nor with radicalism, but rather with big picture analysis of development of civilizations and an articulation of what we might call a project of universal complex civilization. Toynbee was the great historian among them. He chose civilization as his unit of analysis because they are the largest as well as most complex cultural units. As he saw them, at least in his later writings, and he saw them, at least in his later writings, as projects. Here is how W. Warren Waggar, I've been asking historians to tell me how to pronounce this person's name. He's a historian, but so far no one has volunteered. Anyway, so I'll pronounce it Waggar. Here's how he opens his account of this group of thinkers. Arnold Toynbee credits all civilizations so far known with the ambition, conscious or unconscious, of establishing a world order in which the whole of mankind will be able to live together in harmony as members of a single all-inclusive family. None has fully succeeded, but each has tried. It's echoes of Toynbee that I hear. But Toynbee was not the only one in this group of prophets of world civilization, as Waggar called them, from the 1940s. Karl Jaspers, whose work on the axial age and axial civilization was a kind of a brief return to philosophy of history, is another example. The somewhat puzzling and obscure work of Teilhard de Chardin, combining evolutionary biology and theology, which is now being revived under the influence of the internet, is another example, and there are others, Piterim Sorokin, and so on. So as Gorbachev presents his ideas on the need for a new universal civilization, global humanism, one hears echoes of the ideas of this neglected group of thinkers. In the 40s and 50s, they began to articulate a project of a new and universal human civilization. When Cold War descended, their global dreams were marginalized and forgotten. Their fundamentally moderate spirit and their globalism did not fit well into the wild but politically constrained 60s. But with the end of the Cold War, it may be time to return with new seriousness to these formulations of the global project. So that's reform from above seen backwards from Gorbachev writings at the end of the period. Again, reform from below, I don't want to repeat. It's a rebirth rather than a revolution. Let me just briefly say something about that. It was mentioned earlier, at least political science was cited as an authoritative source on what revolutions are. I believe we can actually change our definition of revolution, and I think we should. I think there's no reason to have only one category for periods involving deep transformation. Revolutions combine deep transformation with violence. Let me suggest an alternative form of deep transformation for which we could use the term rebirth or renaissance, which include two components: restoration of continuity with the past, and period of plural creation, reform, and improvement, polycentric, not Cartesian, as Hayek would have it, but also not a Darwinian process leading to a spontaneous order. So a rebirth driven by partnership of reform from above, reform from below. Legacy of 89, global civic society, number 1, color revolutions, number 2. I have a wonderful quote from Cesar Chavez talking to Lukashenko about the issue of color revolutions, and the fact that they sometimes fail doesn't make them any less of a standard methodology that is now available to people around the world. So a third element of the legacy of 89, I would call a project of global constitutionalism. EU is a component of that project, as is WTO. But let me end, as I go over my time, with some comments about significance of 89. So let me suggest a way of looking at the modern age that allows us to see well the significance of 89. We can identify, increasingly well articulated, as the modern age proceeds, two competing forms of the project of human creative power. One might call it the Cartesian or revolutionary radical, The second, I want to call moderate. 89 was a great triumph of the moderate alternative and a new opportunity to articulate it more fully. Among those committed to the development of human creative power, the party of revolution was at least momentarily defeated. Revolution was no longer to be venerated as the fullest embodiment of human creative power. Revolutions easily assumed that role. They were, or were imagined to be, the great moments when the supreme collective human creator, the nation, a people, universal class, rose to destroy all that came before. Create ex nihilo something entirely new, and novus ordo seclorum. Surely, so it seemed, human creative power reached here its ultimate heights. A large-scale version of the individual genius creating something out of nothing in a moment of inspiration. So what is the alternative? The moderate alternative, well, I talk about that in the rest of the paper. The image it draws of large-scale human creation is not simply an expanded version of the individual genius. It is a process in which many participate. It is polycentric, plural, diverse, decentralized, over long stretches of time in which each generation preserves and enhances in a civic spirit. Is that the fact? Oh, I thought I lost power, and I thought that was a way of cutting off my. We can find this process within the same dramatic events that have been known as revolutions, and I go into Hannah Arendt's discussion of the lost treasure of revolutionary tradition, quoting, and unfortunately I haven't quite translated it from French to English, so I'll spare you, but quoting from the Paris Commune, both statements about the continuity to the 12th century Commune tradition and a commitment to the federative idea. So the pattern of councils that is standard in revolutions and councils, Soviet civic committees, organized spontaneously during revolutionary periods and quickly forming into federations, follows unknowingly very old traditions. It follows the communal ideal that the Paris Commune traces to the 12th century and also almost to the letter, the pattern of consociation outlined by Johannes Althusius, the great theorist of complex polity of the 17th century, inspired by the complex patterns of the Holy Roman Empire. Althusius is now often seen as the forgotten alternative to Hobbes. He's an inspiration to the builders of the European Union and to the consociational model of democracy developed by Arndt Leibhardt. In the world of contemporary politics, Switzerland comes perhaps closest to this model. And it does so largely, I think, because it is really hard for outsider to impose things on the Swiss. And so Switzerland has preserved more successfully than anyone else continuity with the Holy Roman Empire. So the Paris Commune, it seems, was trying to return to the politics before the Westphalian age of sovereign unified territorial states. It was trying to be a Switzerland, and doing so, it was revealed practicing the new medievalism avant la lettre. The pattern Arendt is discussing, and it is striking pattern in revolutionary moments, is best seen not as, what she calls it, the lost treasure of the revolutionary tradition, but as the suppressed, marginalized, and hence underdeveloped, inarticulate, and distorted alternative to the revolutionary tradition with deep roots in medieval Europe. And as we can conclude from the speed with which revolutionary councils federate, this alternative does not consist of small-scale politics that one can model on the ancient polis. Athens is not the model. About Athens as a model, it is best to take the perspective of the inhabitants of the island of Melos. The political ideal for the semi-suppressed alternative seems to me quite different. It is to restore continuity with the medieval project of building a complex universal civilization. The model may be Switzerland, and today it can be European Union, and neither is a perfect model, of course, but both preserve some of the political flavor of the medieval project of a universal and complex civilization, both fragmented and unified, exemplifying what, strangely perhaps, is above all an ideal of beauty, unity in variety.
Thank you. Our next presenter is Cornel Ban from Brown University. He will talk about European social democracy.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Tismoianu and Potapevich, for putting this together. I have to begin with a certain immersion in my raconteur mode. I lived 89 in a very Fellinian moment. You all remember Amar Court and the scene of the fascist rally in the center square. I just returned home from a military college. I was a cadet, which was pretty much a cross between a Victorian boarding school and the Leninist regiment. Pretty traumatic experience. And our lieutenant was listening to Radio Free Europe in his office, eating canned fish right before we left. Quite a platform for mobilization, I thought. So at any rate, they sent us home, and my father, who was very much the equivalent of a labor union hoodlum and thug in many ways, had gone to work that morning, and people had been listening to Radio Free Europe and the events in Timișoara and so on and so forth. And a story occurred which coheres very well with the story that Siani Davis gives us about mobilization on the industrial platforms of Timișoara and Cluj. The Fellinian moment began when a certain workers' council was assembled in a certain perverted form of Tilly's argument about the contentious French. The local party activist was chased around the parking lot in a ramshackle truck. And then the head of my father worked as a truck driver for this classic trucking company of the socialist state. They deposed the leadership. There was the moment of ecstasy. This was around 1108 north of Bucharest, not the 1208. And then a certain sense of, if I may put it in bold terms, the libidinal history occurred. Because being in the middle of 30,000 blue-collar workers in Bistrița, one of the unsung heroes of this affair, with literally no glamorous artists and intellectuals to lead the crowds, was a very particular story, and one that should be analyzed in great detail. So on the spectrum between Vaslui and Timișoara, you have Bistrița and Târgu Mureș and so on, and that story has to be looked into because, and here I move between Fellini and classic Argentine tango, there was a certain dance between the crowd and about 25-year-old soldiers in oversized uniforms who had spent most of their military service picking potatoes, and they were being asked to repress the crowds. And that was a little funny moment because we were moving sort of back and forth, and then 1208 came, and the local dentist with the long beard threw the portrait of Ceausescu from one of the windows. And we know the rest, but my point here is twofold. First is the narrative aesthetic point. The second is a certain dedication I would like to make to this sort of middle-range actor of the revolution, and that is an actor that sort of faded away from the politics of memory, and at the risk of irritating my liberal conservative friends, it was the industrial working class. Siani Davis tells the story very well. There have been hundreds and hundreds of workers' councils that were subsequently demobilized by Iliescu's party in January and then instrumentalized for repressive purposes throughout the country. And that story, which is now being analyzed by a sociologist friend, I think brings to the fore the importance of a version of emancipatory politics and aspirations for deepening civic politics that is very Romanian because it occurred against the background of extensive violence being used against them. People figured out how to block the tanks. They were industrial workers at the end of the day. They also figured out the streets. They knew the geography very well. And that the level of organizational sophistication that emerged almost spontaneously and in a way that can hardly be attributed to some sort of conspiracy theory or over-organized civic initiative was simply stunning. And I do not have very good answers. I wouldn't even know how to put together a research design on this. But it remains a puzzling story, and it is also, I think, a moral cause to bring forth their role. The very fact that they were subsequently used to repress the civic opposition in January and later on I think should not diminish the importance of this story itself. Nice segue to the main points I'm trying to make today. I think, what is social democracy in the first place, right? We have to clarify the term. I teach research design to my students, so I've always harassed them with the concept clarification part. Well, this is a historically contingent concept, as is capitalism, as is socialism itself. It began, as we all know, as a revisionist Marxist project that still aimed to overcome capitalism through parliamentary reforms, but after the symbolic moment of the German Social Democratic Party's Bad Godesberg Congress, it became a pretty moderate version of social liberalism. So I think if you actually look at the policies of West European social democratic parties, beginning with the early 1960s down to up to the mid-1980s, and if you're a liberal Rawlsian, I don't think that you'd have too many problems with what they were proposing outside, obviously, the issue of democratic neo-corporatism in Sweden and in other forms of coordinated capitalism. So when we talk about social democracy in 1989, we talk about the post-Bad Godesberg washed out by the supply-side socialism of 1980s, the death of the Keynesian paradigm and the maintenance of a redistributive agenda. Today is a time of anniversary of a splendid collapse, as Zorba the Greek would put it, and it is also a moment of crisis. It is we celebrate the collapse of East European national Stalinisms and national communism and other varieties of those. But we're also living through a crisis of two other paradigms today. We're living through the crisis of neoclassical economics, and I say this as the reader of Financial Times and The Economist, and as the reader of George Akerlof and other liberal economists. And we also live the crisis of the third way, which was a recoding of the post-Bad Godesberg social democracy in a more liberal conservative direction, beginning with the late 1990s. Now, what does this mean for 1989? The main argument I'm trying to make is that 1989 did not have a dramatic effect on the overall history of post-war social democracy. The shift away from the classical moderate agenda of post-Bad Godesberg social democracy had occurred beginning with the late 1970s and had been achieved by 1986, when the Greek Socialist Party is the last to make a right turn in economic policy. The blend between supply-side economics and redistribution and tax reform, the shift from welfare to workfare, we know the story very well. But why does this matter, this for 89 per se? And how does this matter for the agents of change in 1989? I think one of the underdogs of the historical narrative about 1989 is the fact that in the very first months after the collapse of Eastern regimes, polls have been carried out throughout Eastern Europe asking people about what variety of capitalism would they prefer. Of course, people were not so versed in this literature, but they were asked pretty good questions about, would you prefer healthcare to be private or public? Would you prefer wages to be set on an individual basis or on a contractual basis, on a collective bargaining basis? And the results are pretty stunning. Very solid majorities, between 60 and 80%, supported these policies. And what's really interesting about this, and this I think harkens back to the discussion we've had yesterday about what do we mean by capitalism, and the figures that Dr. Gatti has provided us with, is that in countries where there was very high support for capitalism and market reforms, there was very high support for the social democratic policies I was mentioning. And that, I think, should raise a couple of interrogations about how we define our terms and how do we read history very carefully, and what kind of research questions we ask about when we talk about socialism, capitalism, and its alternatives. So that's the first point I was trying to make here. I think that also refers to Kolakowski's well-put argument that Sweden is the best capitalist system, right, in a sense. The second point I'm trying to make is that 89 came at a really bad point for anyone who would have liked to institutionalize a social democratic project in 1989. And that's because the 1973 oil crisis has generated a well-known intellectual crisis of Keynesianism. Without Keynesianism, social democracy was very difficult to sustain, and from an offensive project, it became a defensive one, leading to the paradoxes of the third way we talked about. Other scholars have talked about the roots of the crisis in the fact that social democrats ceased to articulate an understanding of the 1970s stagflation that would still salvage the causal narratives about the economy that they've been selling to their publics for roughly half a century. But irrespective of which side of the debate are you on, whether you're on the more constructivist, ideational debate, or whether you're on the more structuralist or rationalist one, I think what comes to the fore is the fact that 1989 certainly amplified the arguments put forth by the anti-big government actors in the West European political spectrum, in the sense that it is now undeniable that 1989, whether we like it or not, was an anti-state mobilization. Now, the way in which you can interpret that can vary. If you're a radical socialist and you don't have a problem with the anti-state narrative, that's totally all right. If you're on the more liberal conservative end of the spectrum, that certainly feeds into arguments about maintaining even the relics of social democracy as it existed in 1989. Therefore, while 89 was not a watershed for West European social democracy, it certainly weakened the normative statements it was making about the relationship between state, market, and society. This leads me to my third point, and the literature on social democracy, from the more recent contributions of Sherry Berman to the more classical literature on neo-corporatism, brings to the fore the importance of strong state institutions. Now, even if 89 had occurred in 1979, which is before the onslaught of neoclassical economics against Keynesianism, even this had occurred, the worst curse for social democracy in Eastern Europe in the long term was the fact that despite being an authoritarian state, the East European state was a weak state. And that's the paradox that was, I think, extensively elaborated upon. The combination between weak bureaucratization, neo-patrimonialism, forms of neo-feudal cronyism, especially in the pathological case of the Romanian Sultanist regime, have left many of these countries with very few very weak institutional infrastructures for articulating a social democratic project. If the state cannot credibly collect taxes and deliver security of contracts, it becomes very difficult to argue as a social democrat that you need bold state intervention in the economy in the first place, because that becomes a platform for right-seeking, and as Dr. Gallagher has put it very correctly, I think, the redistribution of state assets among crony networks and power holders. So, very difficult to be a social democrat in Eastern Europe in 1999 for both domestic and for exogenous reasons. 89 was both a crisis of West European social democracy. The crisis had been completed by then. West European social democratic parties were heading towards the social liberalism of the third way. Domestically, the institutional requirements for institutionalizing something like this, a more, let's call it, for lack of a better term, a more socially desirable form of capitalism, were not simply there. I would also add to this the intellectual poverty of communist successor parties in their attempt to deal with this. One of my favorite illustrations, and I would not like to go into more details, is the fact that if I remember exactly, one of the most powerful metaphors used by Ion Iliescu in the early 1990s to legitimize sort of policy hybrid he was suggesting back then was the social market economy, which he attributed to Swedish Social Democrats. Now, the social market economy was an ordoliberal concept. It had been the paradigm used by the German right in the 1950s and the Christian Democrats, and it had nothing to do with the Scandinavian or the Austrian social democracy, say. How can you build a credible social democratic project given the very thin library of these people? I wonder to what extent, and actually I haven't seen a Bernstein. Is there a Bernstein in Romanian? I wonder. It is very difficult to find the classical readings, and for that matter, to find any solid political science literature on the topic in the early 1990s. Therefore, this kind of intellectual desert, I think, played a great role in terms of acting as a preemptive strike against imagining an alternative transition future in economic terms in Eastern Europe. My fourth point, a related one, is and sort of related to my Fellini story here, is that from left to right, scholars have raised the issue, have raised an understanding of 1999 as a unique opening in history towards the possibility of deepening civic politics. That was a radically important point, slightly hyperbolically formulated, yet it was very genuine. I would try to relate this point to something that was said yesterday. How was it possible, and this is more like a question than a point I'm trying to make, how was it possible that the politics of morality of the civic mobilization had turned into in many cases, into the pathological policies of inequality and exclusion? In many ways. I mean, what we're talking about, the situation in the hospitals, or we're talking about life expectancy, or the poverty of children in many of these countries, I think the matter should be raised, especially at this moment. And vis-a-vis the relationship between civic mobilization and sort of experiments of an alternative liberal democratic future, I would like to raise the question of why is it that if you're a liberal today and you would like to look for a deepening of the liberal democratic project, you're more likely to find inspiring examples in Porto Alegre, Brazil, than in Prague. And I think there's an overwhelming literature documenting this extensively. So what happened to the emancipatory drive? Of course, there are good explanations that are, well anchored in the institutionalist literature or the literature that looks at the importance of international policy conditionality. However, I would like to go back to the point that was made earlier on today by Dr. Gallagher. What does the European Union mean for 89? And I would twist it a little bit and say, what does the European Union mean for social democracy in Eastern Europe, given the constraints I mentioned? Paradoxically, I think if there's anything positive about that influence, is the fact that despite its problems, I think that the negotiations for European integration have strengthened the state capacity, or at least have created a hope that state institutions will not be mere hollow shells in the future. And that could be a reason of hope for somebody aiming for whether we call it social democracy or social liberalism in the future, it doesn't really matter, but that's a reason for hope. Whereas I'm very skeptical that had the European integration project not existed, I don't think there would have been any incentives to launch any kind of initiative of this sort. Finally, a descriptive aspect. What does social democracy mean in Eastern Europe in the past 15 years? We have a couple of inconvenient truths here, I believe. The first is that, with the sole exception of the Czech Republic, in all other countries where nominally social democratic parties exist, those parties are all communist successor parties. The Baltic countries have had a number of new social democratic parties, but they're completely wiped out. They're below 3%. They've had no impact on policy whatsoever. Inconvenient truth number one. Inconvenient truth number two. Wherever the political competition was between liberal conservative coalitions on the one hand and communist successor parties on the other hand, you have less poverty and less inequality than in countries where the political debate was between liberals and conservatives. The Baltic countries, I think, are illustrative in this regard in the sense that they've had breakneck economic growth and breakneck growth of poverty. And it's pretty spectacular if you compare the Baltic countries in this regard with Hungary. We've been lambasting Hungary for the past 2 days, I think, excessively. But certainly there is less social drama there than there is in the Baltic countries, despite, again, the phenomenal economic growth there. So this is another aspect, I think, that should be investigated further. And somebody raised the legitimate issue to what extent the ethnic politics in the Baltic countries have played a role. And unfortunately, we don't have good data to distinguish between the ethnic Russian minority and the majority there. But I think it's a very good point. And finally, there's the Slovenian exception. And that's a very puzzling case in many ways. It's easy to dismiss. Slovenia is a rich country that couldn't afford social democracy. A book just came out on the social democracy in the Third World by Patrick Heller. They look at Brazil, Chile, Kerala in India, Costa Rica. The argument being made is that you can be a middle-income countries, but combine economic growth and a fair redistribution of income in quite virtuous ways and in quite sustainable ways in the long run. So I would therefore oppose the argument that we can talk about the Slovenian social democratic experiment merely based on its on the fact that it's a wealthy country relative to other East European states. Now, Slovenia is very interesting because it's not usually talked about, but if you look at the kind of quality of life indicators, it looks more like it's somewhere between Austria and Sweden. And on matters of poverty, it is above Denmark. Now, that I think raises the issue of how much agency there is left in encoding a social democratic project in Eastern Europe. Certainly, countries like Romania or Poland would have much greater difficulties at coming up with something like that. But it nevertheless does beg the question of to what extent some of the impossibility of social democracy in Eastern Europe was the result of structurally determined factors or was the result of bad social democratic projects in that region. I would end this presentation with 3 remarks. Europe experience with social liberalism beginning with the 1990s saw increases in poverty nearly everywhere. There are only 2 exceptions. The World Bank data confirmed this. The non-propertied and the unemployed and the working poor will be around, and as long as we have liberal democracy, somebody has to address their claims. The question is, who will do that? The third way is in crisis. It cannot sell a narrative about what is happening right now in OECD because they themselves contributed to some of the processes that some argue led to the crisis, from the regulation to allowing hedge funds to be set up inside insurance companies. So the matter of credibility is huge here. However, should such discontent be expressed in an authoritarian register rather than in a social democratic one, I think the chances of what Sherry Berman aptly called social democracy's dark twin, fascist and neo-fascist projects, are pretty well situated to address the socio-economic discontent that might ensue. And I think rereading her story about why the Great Depression led to one project in Sweden and to a very different project in Germany is a very important act given the times we go through. The second matter I would like to raise is that currently it's very difficult if you're a neoclassical economist to deny that the neoclassical economic paradigm is not in crisis. If you look at very important names who went beyond reeling from the crisis and started to talk about it, from, I don't know if you want to talk about Martin Wolf in Financial Times to a couple of very prominent academic economists, there is a pretty solid consensus that there are problems with this paradigm. Here's the question I want to raise. The basic reason why there was a shift between classical social democracy after Bad Godesberg towards the third wave of the 1980s was because the economic paradigm on which it relied, which was Keynesian economics, had collapsed. Now, if neoclassical economics has a problem, this in theory should mean a huge opportunity for reinventing social democracy. However, what we're seeing is the opposite. We're seeing that it's more likely that social democracy will go down in history as a great idea and a very contingent one, and it is very hard to identify any either ideational or institutional basis for seeing any potential of its rejuvenation. I will end my talk with a quote from Mark Blyth, a very astute observer of the social democratic century. I'm just going to quote from him. Social democracy may have been a good idea, but it was also a post-war phenomenon brought about by the devastation fascism brought upon itself. If World War II hadn't happened, if Strasser had bested Hitler, if the xenophobia had stayed in the bottle, would fascism have fallen? While counterfactuals are at best a parlor game, they are nonetheless helpful in clarifying possibilities. If the war had not happened, and if the alternative of the Soviet Union had not risen to post-war prominence, would the need to placate the working classes of Europe with welfarism and social democracy been so pressing? Would a social democratic victory have come about at all, never mind later than advertised? I end here, and I would welcome your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And our last paper is Viktor Zaslavsky's The Long Death of the Italian Communist Party.
Thank you. We just heard a talk about the long march of European social democracy, so I will be talking about the long death of the Italian Communist Party. So our topics dovetail, even if we did not agree in advance. The underlying social transformation of European society exhausted the programs and visions of the traditional communist parties, determined their almost uninterrupted decline. All the attempts by such major communist parties of Europe as French, Italian, and Spanish to reverse this trend by distancing themselves from the Soviet Union and by creating a new model of the international communist movement known as Eurocommunism failed. This degenerative process underwent a sudden acceleration in 1989-1991. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet collapse, West European Communist Parties turned into small sectarian groups without political influence, gradually losing any relation to social reality. In this regard, the Italian Communist Party represented an exception in both national and international context. The PCI managed not only to maintain the loyalty of its electorate, but also to be reintegrated in the ranks of the Socialist International. So, during the decade after the Soviet collapse, the ex-PCI turned into a largest single party in the center-left coalitions, and in alliance with a variety of other forces, in 1996 to 2001, managed to arrive to power. So I would like to explore this paradoxical outcome and analyze the strategies employed by PCI's leadership to avoid the charges of political corruption and to join the forces of the European left. In 1992-1993, a series of corruption scandals that entered the Italian history under the code name of Tangentopoli, literally bribes city, a sharp conflict broke out between the Italian judiciary and the leadership of the major parties that dominated the government of post-war Italy for more than 40 years. The ensuing Mani Puliti, clean hands, Mani Puliti operation engulfed such major leaders as Giulio Andreotti and Bettino Craxi, who were put on trial. By the beginning of 1994, more than 300 deputies of the parliament, 100 senators, thousands of local politicians from different parties, mainly from the Christian Democratic Party and Socialist Party, were under criminal investigation. The ruling elites of the Christian Democrat and Socialist parties, as well as those of several smaller parties, were decimated. By 1994, the old Italian party system has ceased to exist. The PCI managed to survive the acute phase of Tangentopoli practically unscathed. There were several reasons for this. The process of PCI's adjustment to a changing reality began already during the years of the leadership of Enrico Berlinguer, the most influential general secretary of the PCI after Togliatti. Berlinguer's reputation of protagonist of the moral question in Italy is based on PCI's anti-corruption drive that Berlinguer started during 1975-1976 electoral campaign. It manifested itself in its electoral slogans, which counterposed the Communist Party with Mani Puliti, this is the expression clean hands, to the ruling Christian Democrat Party, ridden with corruption scandals. This policy met with an immediate success in the 1976 elections, when the PCI accumulated practically 35% of the vote, the highest point ever reached by the party in the post-war period. The hidden dimension of Berlinguer's anti-corruption policy was represented by his decision to put an end to the Soviet subsidies to the PCI. The funding of the PCI by the Soviet Union has become an object of historical inquiry only after the opening of Russian archives. The principal difficulty in piecing together a complete analysis lies in the fact that Soviet financing of the PCI and other communist parties, this financing arrived via two different channels, actually three, but I will be talking about two. An obvious source of financing consisted of direct monetary funding provided to the PCI and other pro-Soviet Italian forces by the Soviet leadership during the Cold War. Here we have full documentation, and we can learn what was the funding, for example, 1979 to Italian Communist Party, or French Communist Party, or American Communist Party, or San Marino Communist Party, and so on and so on, the whole long list of communist parties. There was a second, indirect conduit based on a simple and efficient scheme originally introduced in the late 1940s and remained largely unchanged during the subsequent decades. The Soviet Union would supply PCI-controlled enterprises with raw materials, mostly oil and gas, at below market prices, with the difference going to the Communist Party's coffers. The Italian entrepreneurs involved in trade with the Soviet Union to gain contracts had often employed communist intermediaries and pay a percentage remitted to the PCI. During some periods, indirect financing exceeded other types of Soviet financial support to the Communist Party, but currently available documents are insufficient to compile a quantitative account of indirect Soviet financing. The problem is that KGB's archives and Ministry of Foreign Trade archives in Soviet Union, Soviet archives this type are closed. Accessible documents do, however, allow the historical reconstruction of the direct financing provided by Moscow to the international communist movement and to the PCI in particular. The hidden tier of Berlinguer's anti-corruption campaign consisted in his attempts to wean the PCI from Soviet financing that had become even more dangerous for the party after the approval of the law on public financing of political parties in 1974. By 1980-1981, only a few years, 3 years before his death, Berlinguer would have succeeded in stopping Soviet subsidies, even if, I repeat, this applied only to direct financing transferred to the PCI by Moscow. Other Soviet aid to various pro-Soviet organizations, loss-making Communist Party newspapers, and indirect financing via the so-called commercial channels continued until the collapse of the Soviet regime. It's worth emphasizing that neither the existence of regular Soviet subsidies nor its subsequent interruption were openly admitted by the PCI and Berlinguer. The PCI received more Soviet financing and for a longer time than any other European or American Communist Party in the 20th century. By benefiting from massive foreign funding, the PCI could maintain a large corps of paid functionaries. Soviet financing not only paid their salaries, but also subsidized some of the principal activities of the party, newspapers and other party publications, electoral campaigns, and various public mobilization initiatives, like the campaigns for peace and so on. During the 1991-1993, the Parliamentary Commission on Terrorism of the Italian Parliament, the so-called Commissione Stragi, requested from the Office of the Attorney General of the Russian Federation, after collapse of the Soviet Union, obviously, the documentation on Soviet subsidies to the PCI and other political forces of Italy. The request coincided with the attempt on the part of the Yeltsin administration to open a trial of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union as a criminal organization. As a result, the Russian government delivered to the Italian investigators a great deal of documents related to Soviet funding of the PCI and materials that shed light on deals between various Italian firms and Soviet import-export organizations, replete with special provisions to provide aid to the PCI. Had these documents been available during the Tangentopoli campaign, the PCI in all likelihood would have shared the fate of Christian Democrats and socialist parties. But here I would stress what Agnes Heller started our meeting yesterday, talking about the role of historical accidents. This is a historical accident. Sheer luck helped the PCI, because the Commissione Stragi, the Soviet Italian Parliament, consisting of senators from both governing opposition parties, was caught completely unprepared to deal with the Soviet documentation. So it was classified, and only in the second half of the 1990s, after the peak of anti-corruption campaign had been reached, and this material became gradually available for historical analysis. At the time, I was nominated as consultant for this Commissione Stragi commission, and I was given access to all these documents, not by chance, but because I was a foreigner, and they did not trust local consultants in this case, because there were a great deal of material of very personal character. So another point which I would like to stress, why the Communist Party was saved and remained practically untainted for several years. The party members chosen to conduct the secret operations with Soviet funds were particularly dedicated members, true believers, highly committed to ideological principles. They perceived themselves as professional revolutionaries and saw the party as heroic, charismatic, and extraordinary organization operating under constant threat in a hostile environment. So, during the Tangentopoli campaign, their experience of belonging to an opposition party ready to be outlawed and go underground prepared them to withstand the interrogations and imprisonment without surrendering. Italian investigators and judges who placed a particular weight on the admittance of personal guilt failed to condemn these functionaries who refused to testify against the PCI and refused to explain the origins and destinations of huge sums of money received from uncooperative banks and financial organizations of the former Soviet bloc. Famous case is the case of the so-called Compagno Griganti, Comrade G. You could see, his T-shirts with names Eviva Campagna G. He was released. He received several millions of dollars, mainly from the Dresdner Bank, but from other banks, of East European people's countries, and claimed that these were personal loans, and judges could not find the origins and destinations of these sums of money. So he was released for insufficient evidence and was welcomed as hero by the PCI rank and file members. You could see demonstrations with these people with T-shirts, Eviva Campagna G, in the streets. Let's come to the period 1989-1991. Having stopped calling itself communists, having changed its symbols, and having split into Communist Party, the PDS, Partito Democratico di Sinistra, PDS, and Communist Refoundation Party, the old PCI seemingly ceased to exist. The suddenness of the transformation could only be compared with that of the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. Overnight, 1 million Italian communists were eliminated, 1 million post-communists born. But it would be a gross exaggeration to take at face value the affirmations of PDS leaders that the PCI was dead and totally new party emerged instead. Virtually all the leaders of the PDS are former leaders of the PCI. The symbolic center of the new party remains the same old one, and throughout the country, members of the new party continued to meet on the premises of the old one. The PDS and Communist Refoundation Party maintained even their geographical base, since the territorial distribution of their electorate remained the same of the old PCI, with communist vote having been concentrated in the so-called Red Belt of Italy, Tuscany, Umbria, Emilia-Romagna, and Marca. Mark Lazar from Sciences Po has noticed that the PDS became, of its territorial rootedness, might be called the League of the Center, analogous to the Northern League founded by Umberto Bossi. Then you see the change in leadership. The leadership of the party passed to a new group, of leaders, the so-called quarantenni, 40 years old. It was a tightly knit group of young communist militants raised in the ranks of the Italian Federation of Young Communists, who came to the top of the PDS in the early 1990s and managed to preserve their unity, avoiding struggles and maintaining their leadership position for the next 15 years until now. Massimo D'Alema, the former head of the Italian Federation of Young Communists and the editor-in-chief of the major PCI newspaper L'Unità, has become the leader of the quarantenni, took over the party leadership. The major problem encountered by this new secretary of the PDS was to find collocation of the party in the emerging new system of political parties of Italy. D'Alema realized that to attract the moderate electorate, the PDS had to move toward the center of political spectrum and acquire the status of the center-left party. But this position had already been occupied by the Italian socialists. Here the effects of the Tangentopoli and the Mani Pulite operation proved crucial. Thanks to the secrecy that shrouded all the financial subsidies and transactions between the PCI and the Soviet Union, the PDS remained largely untainted by the corruption and illegal funding scandals. So the PDS seized the opportunity presented by the collapse and dissolution of its major rivals, the Democratic Christians and the PCI Socialist Party, and managed to replace the latter, Socialist Party, as a major center-left party of Italy. I would like to quote from 1995 book-length interview by D'Alema, explained the PCI strategy after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wrote as follows: "We had no alternative. We were like a big Indian tribe trapped in a mountain canyon with only one way out. And there stood Craxi with his proposal of socialist unity. How could we escape from the canyon? Craxi enjoyed an obvious advantage. He was the head of the Socialist Party in a West European country, and therefore he represented the left suitable for Italy. But he also suffered from a disadvantage, that of being Craxi. Historically, the socialists proved to stay on the right side, but they had become a corrupt group that clung to the Christian Democrats. Socialist unity could have been a great success, but without Craxi. Thus, we, the communists, had only one choice, to become the Socialist Party of Italy. Joining the Socialist International became a logical step to demonstrate the profound transformation of the PDS, and in the 1996 general elections, the PDS became the principal component of the winning center-left coalition, Uliva, whose head, Romano Prodi, will be giving a talk here in a few days. This, for the first time since the war, left-dominated government ruled Italy. And to finish, what is the situation today? The adoption of a new electoral law with a 4% minimum threshold for party representation has had important consequences. In the 2008 general elections, all the parties which preserved a direct connection with the Communist Party of the past, such as the Communist Refoundation Party, the Party of Italian Communists, and another small communist party, failed to win seats in the parliament. Parliament, the first time in the post-war Italy, had no communist participation. The generational change that occurred since the split of the PCI, the exit of the PDS from the political scene, the subsequent mutations of the PDS, combined with the empirical evidence that the party has abandoned the revolutionary ideology and become a stable component of the democratic coalitions, all this might serve as a proof that the Italian communism has finally completed its life cycle. Such conclusion necessitates a qualification. In the October 2009 elections, 2 weeks ago, elections of the secretary of the newly coined Democratic Party, there were several changes, PDS, DS, now it's PD. A newly coined Democratic Party, the winner has been Pierluigi Bersani, a former member of the PCI and representative of the second echelon of the Emilia-Romagna communist nomenclatura. He won against his major rival, left Catholic Dario Franceschini, in both categories of voters, registered members of the PDA and supporters without PD's membership. Bersani has been a minister in 3 center-left governments led by Giuliano Amato, Romano Prodi, and D'Alema, and D'Alema remains his major political sponsor. After Bersani's elections, another leader of PD, Francesco Rutelli, former mayor of Rome, has noticed that the majority of the members of this new party migrated from the PCI through the DS, then the PDS to today PD, but still think of themselves as belonging to the regional party that is PCI. The continuity between the PCI and the considerable part of the PD, both on the level of leadership and rank-and-file members, is evident. And last remark, more importantly, even if the communist project proved utopian, the political culture of the PCI continues to exercise a noticeable influence in many areas of Italian society. Especially, I would stress the character of political struggle. It's among the legacies of the communist political culture. These are very prominent. The delegitimation and demonization of political opponents and adversaries without presenting a realistic alternative program, and the construction of the left's political identity on the basis of anti-capitalism and anti-Americanism. So Italian democracy has not surmounted these legacies yet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My job is to discuss these papers, but since each one of them goes into different directions, and since we had this panel on the return of history and the keynote lecture on the 1989 and the return to history, I thought it's a good opportunity for me to highlight three themes I think are important when attempting to summarize post-communist efforts to come to terms with the communist past, which is a theme that really ties into my own work. I think in each case of these three themes, the expectations East Europeans held in 1989 were contradicted by communist reality, and all three themes show how revolutions are betrayed, as Professor Heller told us yesterday. My conclusion is not as pessimistic about this. Sometimes I think it's good that revolutions are betrayed. So the first theme I want to bring up here is the scope of transitional justice in Eastern Europe. The initial expectations were grand, called for comprehensive transitional justice. But 20 years after 1989, it is evident that post-communist transitional justice was an exercise in moderation. Coming to terms with the communist past in Eastern Europe did not escalate in the witch hunt that some of the scholars predicted. Victims did not take revenge on their former victimizers. Transitional justice did not lead to major social upheavals, but at the same time, the return of history did not lead to Nuremberg-type trials and did not lead in radical lustration programs that would have marginalized the communist decision makers and secret agents and contribute to the emergence of a completely new political elite. Now we can discuss why this was the case. Maybe Gabor Halmai is correct to say that living well was the best revenge Eastern Europeans could take on their former victimizers. Maybe the Poles are right. At the beginning of the 1990s, they believed that amnesty, not amnesia, was the solution. Maybe other factors are at play, but we can discuss this during the question and answer part. The second theme I want to mention here regards the methods of transitional justice. Again, the expectations initially were that transitional justice would take the form of hardcore judicial methods. And here I would include court trials and radical lustration with job loss. But again, 20 years after 1989, we see that, in fact, court trials and lustration were the least employed methods to reckon with the communist past. Maybe because justice was not the top priority in Eastern Europe, as was, for example, in other parts of the world, but truth and memory took the center stage. The good news in this failed expectation fulfillment is that biology took care of the cases when political will was not there to marginalize the perpetrators of communist times. They simply died, or they were too old to have an input in the political process. Now, the bad news is that, as we've heard many times today and yesterday, the politics of the present took over from the politics of the past, and the transitional justice in Eastern Europe 20 years after 1989 is more about the present as it is about what really happened under communist times. And the third issue I want to raise is the timing of transitional justice. And again, the initial expectations were that transitional justice will take place resolutely and swiftly at the beginning of the 1990s, immediately after the collapse of the communist regime. During that window of opportunity John Elster or Helga Welsh are talking about, which allowed for a convergence of political will and popular expectations in this regard. From their perspective, if transitional justice did not materialize during the early 1990s, then a country simply blew its chance to assume its recent past in any form. But in reality, what happened was that late reckoning with the communist past did take place. And in some settings, in some political settings, and in the case of some types of crimes, it might be even more desirable than early transitional justice. So as some methods lose their edge, we can no longer have court trials or radical lustration with job loss because the people are simply no longer there. Yeah, they either died or they retired from their positions. New methods can be entertained and applied, and I think Romania again is an example in this case because it was able to set up the Tismananu Commission, and we have here some of the members of that commission, which operated outside the framework predicted initially by scholars. So from this point of view, I would say that the battle for coming to terms with the communist past is now not completely lost. Maybe the best is yet to come in some respect. Well, having said that, I want to thank the conference organizers for bringing us here, and I want to open the floor for some questions. So maybe we should take a number of questions, and then each one of you have the chance to answer them.
Elizabeth Ponda, journalist and author in Berlin. Jim, I'd like to, I'm no political theorist, and I would like to pose a pragmatic question. I hope it's not out of place in this conference. Because I would be interested from your exploration of these issues, if you feel that any of the new democracies in Central Europe did a better job or getting a better balance between justice and reconciliation than Germany did. And I don't know, perhaps Ms. Stan would like to comment on that too.
Okay. Julia, we have a question here.
Okay, so the first question is regarding transitional justice again. And normally when we speak about this, we compare the model of transitional justice. And the first model, of course, it was a success model, and this South African Commission for Reconciliation and Truth. And we have to take into account why this commission succeeded at the end, because this is the main question. Afterwards, of course, we have some mixed effect that Professor McAdams described in South America, and of course Eastern Europe was not on the good premise from the beginning. But the main question is the following: how we can have transitional justice in countries with such a weak justice? You know, it's a kind of paradox again. If we have a weak judiciary, how you can have transitional justice? Which kind of transitional justice you can have? So the only exception stays South African, because the beginning of the South African, it was generally a success story. Now it's open with the new president elected of the South Africa, and because it was constructed in this way, you know, that the truth was mixing with the no following by somebody to put in jail. So it was a very good mixture. But all the other mechanisms that were settled in other countries, for instance, in Algeria, they were settled commission and everything. Everybody was on failed. And the main question is the following, because Lavinia made a very interesting comparison with Nuremberg. It is that at a certain moment, the international community realized something very interesting with the creation of the International Criminal Court, that there are countries that are not able to do justice by themselves to their criminals. So this is the reason in the status of the International Criminal Court to have the complementarity principle, which said that if a country is not able to do this, they are going to go to the International Criminal Court. So maybe this is the main reason why transitional justice couldn't work in all these countries around. That were, and of course, I agree very much with what Lavinia said. I think, in this respect, Romania was with Smananu report, I think, has the best solution, because this way, it was the way to deal with the past, the best way to deal with the past in the context that we had in the Eastern Europe at the moment, for the reason that I exposed very, very shortly here. My second question is regarding what my colleague from Brown University said about how we can, as I understood, how we can be social democrats in Eastern Europe, or if we can be social democrats in Eastern Europe. It's more Fellinian, I know, and Fellini has a lot of phases in his cinema. And how do you think that the social acquis, because you said that this was the only chance to have a social democracy in Eastern Europe, except Slovenia. How do you think that the social acquis of the European Union will be integrated in Eastern Europe? Because it is a social acquis there, which is very strong, and it has to be integrated in a way. So how can we deal with this?
Yeah, very, very brief intervention. I would say, Cornel, I think you mentioned actually two things. I think it is absolutely, indeed, Peter Siani Davis in his book on the Romanian Revolution mentions this emerging councils forms, workers' councils. As a matter of fact, we talked a lot about Kotkin's book. Kotkin's book is dedicated to Paul Lendvai. This is a very important thing. That's not a book that ignores political history. It's dedicated to Mr. Political History in East Central Europe. So you have to look at why am I emphasizing Lendvai, what's the connection. The new book that I reviewed for TLS, the new book by Lendvai, focuses fundamentally on the Workers' Council experience, on what fascinated Arendt and made her write a new afterword to the book on revolution, because precisely Hungarian Revolution of '56 really meant a lot for her. And this is the mystery of '89, and it's very interesting to see how they re-emerged the Workers' Councils, what was the type of participatory radical democracy, and there were, at this moment, I remember there was some debate between some of us, will it be democracy without parties? Remember the piece by Elizabeth Keys, a political theorist in the United States, in Dissent magazine, actually, was this title, Democracy Without Parties, ? That's one thing, just an idea. Second, Archie Brown, after all, there's nobody, I think, in the world who knows more about every single footnote in Gorbachev's biography. He's already part of that biography. Archie Brown published a book which is called 7 Years That Shook the World, about the history of glasnost and perestroika. And what he demonstrates that we all refer to the extremely tedious, boring, and annoying book Perestroika by Gorbachev, which was a kind of propaganda manifesto, which was published with lots of money, etc., etc. At the same time, Gorbachev wrote another book in 1988, which is a social democratic book. So Gorbachev, at that moment, these are his reflections based on his reading. And apropos of what Gela is, you may want to look, unless you did it already, into Archie's book. Gorbachev read Bernstein. And these are his reflections on Edward Bernstein's The Premises of Socialism. So Gorbachev, in '88, he's still General Secretary of the Central Committee moves in the direction of social democracy. So he really realized that Leninism, Bolshevism is a dead end, and it's there. This is, I think, the great contribution, because I didn't know all this stuff. I wrote something, and Archie wrote me letters, and then, you know, I published, if you want to see what I said, I published in Perspectives on Politics, the review. Okay, thank you.
We have another question
there. My name is Dmitry Noyuk. I'm from another planet, not from your community. But I may be the oldest among you. I spent 58 years in Soviet Union, and I left Soviet Union with the last group of refuseniks, if you know what does it mean, after 12 years of suppressed by Soviet Union and Gorbachev power including. I have not question, because I don't see any meaningful discussion here. I am afraid that it's the weakest conference I ever listened in my long life. I'll reserve my right for conclusion remarks after your conclusion remarks. But I need to say something about what's said it's here by Mr. Karol Solon about Gorbachev. You don't know facts. Simply. Gorbachev influence. Behind Gorbachev is Alexander Yakovlev. It's who architecture and doer of glasnost and perestroika in Soviet Union. Gorbachev nothing to do with this. He's, to say the truth, as any general secretary of Communist Party. He is criminal.
Thank you very much. We now we have one more question, and that's it. We'll give them some time to respond.
Yes, my name is Sorin Dragan. I am from Romania. I'm one of the guys who were involved 20 years ago in December '89 and was forced into exile by the socialist regime that followed. And my question, primarily addressed to Ms. Tan, would be an invitation to elaborate, well, I suppose in order to convince me, albeit maybe rhetorically, that this road to justice through the report of the Tismaneanu Commission is a preferred alternative to timely justice delivered in lieu of, that solution with biology taking care of the retired apparatchiks enjoying their privileges and their fat pensions to the end of their natural life. In the conditions that the degraded society is basically transitioning to a stage in which political concerns cease to deal with the past and more with the present, and I suppose that's kind of natural. But also in comparison with the Nuremberg issue, where although the concrete danger of Nazi resurgence was not an issue as such, but the demonization of that regime, of those principles, of those ideas was. We failed to deliver this, and now my question to you is, could you kindly elaborate on why this might be the better course for, I'm asking in the name of the Romanian society, but East Europe in general. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm part of the Romanian society too. Okay, so should we start from there and each one of us has some kind of, 2 minutes, 2 minutes each, 1 minute each to say what we want to say.
I want to give my time
to Jim. Okay, Jim.
Thanks so much. Well, I already used lots of time, so I'll make this fairly quick. In terms of transitional justice, there are 4 prominent types. One is criminal trials, second is truth commissions, third is administrative disqualification, and the fourth is the way that you deal with unresolved property questions. And, even if the West Germans would rather have had control over some of these issues and perhaps not had to deal with some of them, I must say that I eventually concluded that they did a commendable job and better than other states. On 3 of them, the one thing they did a terrible job with was the so-called Enquete Commission, which is their truth commission, which suffered from a lot of the processes that we've seen in Eastern Europe, and that it was very politicized. And in the German case, it was so politicized that it ended up being empty. I have tried to read all 11 volumes, and I gave up before. I still kept reading them, but I realized that there was no meaning after a while. Now, perhaps here, Vlad and others who are involved in the commission in Romania will have an opportunity to approach these questions in a different way. And a lot of that, for me, comes down to how you deal with and interpret history. Second, about weak judiciaries, it's a great question. How do you, if you have a weak judiciary, how can you deal, or how can you apply justice? And, on the one hand, the answer is no. On the other, when you look at Latin America, what makes it interesting is that in their efforts to deal not just with these, but many aspects of the pursuit of justice, they created strong judiciaries. So as long as these episodes were interacting, and in those cases when they did interact, you see the development of robust constitutions and stronger judiciaries. And they're interactive. They've taken place over time. I think that the International Criminal Court is best suited to countries of collapse, and of which Yugoslavia is one, and there are others. I say the other thing that I would throw in here is I don't think the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa was so impressive. But that's just me. That's an unpopular point. So these are my quick responses.
I think I used up probably my extra time in my presentation, so let me just take the opportunity to do what I didn't do at the beginning of my presentation, which was to thank the organizers for an excellent conference.
Cornel?
Thank you so much for the question. You're entirely correct. Voila. I think you're entirely correct. The EU does matter in terms of reconfiguring the perspectives of a more social liberal project. It's very hard to call it social democratic right now. However, the social acquis is the thinnest legislation of the entire infrastructure of EU rules, about 35,000 pages. It talks about really insignificant issues like health and safety. It's pretty much, very much like trying to regulate plumbers and making people wear helmets while on construction sites. But I think that there are 3 more ways in which the EU matters a little bit more than through the social acquis. That is to say, in those countries where institutions of coordination between labor, capital, and the state had collapsed, such as in Hungary or in the Baltic states, EU integration managed to stem the deregulation. The Orban government's initiative to scrap collective bargaining was reversed in 2002 as a result of EU negotiations. Same thing for the Baltic countries. The effects have been relatively marginal, but they did exist, and we don't know exactly how they will develop in the future. It remains very much up to how much social democracy will be injected in the very European project itself. But there's another way in which the EU matters. It matters a lot through these transnational party networks in which communist successor parties are integrated. The Party of European Socialists integrated many of these. The effects, however, so far have been rather perverse in some cases. The Romanian PSD is the combination between a socially conservative party and a social liberal party, and the Party of European Socialists hasn't had much impact on that. It's a very odd case. I mean, it's literally like the Republican Party plus some post-communist formation. On the contrary, the Party of European Socialists often upheld the cause of the PSD despite such dissents from the social liberal line. The third way in which the European Union matters is through the transnational labor networks. And this, in my research, I found that is the most significant way in which it has mattered indeed. For example, the European Confederation of Labor Unions has been instrumental in diffusing expertise into East European labor unions, especially in those that have been besieged by disorganization and loss of direction. The Romanian Labor Code is pretty much the result, the current Romanian Labor Code of 2003 is the result of such transnational labor coalition. And that's a very measurable impact we could look at. I think this is important for, especially in times of crisis, because, we'd probably rather manage the anger created by socio-economic discontent in a left-wing labor union than to see people marching in the National Guard or one of those formations that have appeared throughout Eastern Europe. I think there is a moderating effect that the European Union has created, which leads me to my final point. That is to say, the social democratic agenda is very weak in the EU legislation. It is also very weak in the EU political agenda, given the diversity of types of capitalism. It is one thing to be a social democrat in Sweden and completely different in Britain. So this has consequences. I would end here. Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll stop here. Thank you very much. And I think in 10 minutes we have the keynote address. Thank you.